were in Canada, in Quebec, and you were a lapsed Catholic, a French lapsed Catholic, you were 4 times as likely to be a separatist during the separatist, uprising, say in the 1980s and 1990s in Canada, or 1960s through the 1990s. The Gallup poll indicated that. And so, Quebec was the last place in Western Europe, in some sense, that, so to speak, where Catholicism dissolved, and that didn't happen until the late 1950s, and it was instantly replaced by a radical nationalism, which really, I watched it from the outside. I was in Quebec for much of that. It was impenetrable. You could see that it was a displaced religious doctrine. The state had taken the place of Christ. That's the simplest way of putting it.
Well, that's a great. I think that's a great historical example. I think that at a minimum, what many people perceive in these sort of so-called woke movements is at least some incipient or inchoate vision of justice, that the least of these among us matters. The different among us matters. Now, of course, I think that the standpoint that is through which these things are viewed is completely tragic and unfulfillable, unable to fulfill the very ends that it seeks to bring about. But the conservatives and free market lovers and all these people very often lament the fact. They say, why is it that this, we call it the left, call it whatever you want, seems to beat us on the moral argument every time, despite the fact that we know that our systems and the ideas that we espouse historically have been shown to be superior to the very values that the so-called left is beating us at. And I think that this does raise the fact that I've been reading Tupi's wonderful coffee table book. I know you had a wonderful conversation with him recently about how much better everything is getting.
In absolute terms, yeah.
In absolute terms, and this is a wonderful. It's a very important book. These are wonderful achievements. We should all rejoice and absolutely face them and be glad for them and the things that they will make possible. But it is also very interesting to note what is not in Tupi. There's no talk about beauty. There's no talk about architecture. There's no talk about cultural achievement. There's no talk about, let's put it this way, there is no talk about many of the things that are most fundamental to the meaning in human life. And that's not to degrade or denigrate the achievements that are being spoken about there, but it is rather to say that if your metric for human flourishing is, do we have enough to eat, and are we not getting rained on? And you go through these lists of kind of fundamentally material things, all of which are fundamentally important, and not only because they're material, because there's also a spiritual dimension to those things for human beings. But the point I'm making is that
you see the same thing in Steven Pinker's work, like the blank slate. I hope I've got this right, because I've read a couple of Pinker's books. But one of the things, so he thinks very much like Tupi thinks, and he wrote the Better Angels of Our Nature, if I remember correctly, as well, showing that human aggression has decreased substantially over the last number of centuries. But all of the qualities of humanity that you describe are they're parsed off near the end of the book into a single chapter, as if they're just secondary side effects of some more profound rationality, let's say. And it's the rationality that's concentrating on material well-being. And I don't have anything against material well-being and the elimination of privation, but there is, and it's interesting that you make that comment about Tupi's work, is that the spiritual dimension, it's like the list of what should be attended to have a meaningful life that I listed at the beginning of our talk. At the end, I capped that off with some attention to be paid for the spiritual or moral or religious element of life to bring everything together. And that narrow focus on material well-being, necessary though it is, does seem to lack there's something in it that's missing, that's absolutely fundamental, that if it's missing, undermines the whole project, or appears to.
Well, I think the bottom line is that there is no deep human realization for any individual outside of understanding her or himself in relation to higher order principles, truths, realities. That's just what human beings are. So that is not to denigrate the necessity of improvement in all these areas that Tupi so brilliantly chronicles. I don't portray myself as somehow anti-Tupi. I'm a huge fan of this. I'm a huge fan of the inclusive institutions that they describe as necessary to human flourishing. But I think it needs to be said that in the most developed places, so-called developed places of the world, skepticism about those inclusive institutions is higher than anywhere else, or at least arguably so. I think it needs to be said that there's nothing in the book about the very disturbing trends of rising suicide, of rising of dopamine addiction, of porn addiction in young men, of course, especially. These are, and I think it needs to be said that many of these things that appear to be a very fundamental malaise of contemporary life are also related to technology. And one of the paradoxes, I think, that I love to ask you about, Jordan, relative to your own work on the individual and human individual realization, is that if on the one hand, human beings are becoming increasingly liberated from, the demands of material necessity. I mean, the amount of time it took they bring up brilliantly to create light, for example, was an immense amount of work, or to save up enough calories to make it through a winter. All of these, the bone-grindingly hard aspect of human existence for millennia. Then we are very rapidly in the last 2 centuries, now almost every human being in the planet, not everyone, but the vast majority, are living at standards of living that were inconceivable by anyone just a few centuries ago. So these are amazing achievements. But it also needs to be said that insofar as, on the one hand, the individual is being liberated from these those bone-crushing realities, at the same time, it does appear to be a key aspect of modern life that individuals are finding themselves less connected, more alienated, and that the very technology in some respects that liberates them also appears to homogenize in a kind of globally reductive way, such that, as human life is lived on the ground, the frame in which it's actually lived and in which meaning is derived, that has become more distant, harder to access, and that we have far fewer of the tools we might have once had to make sense of that all-important sphere.
I've talked to Bjorn Lomborg and to Matt Ridley and to Marian Tupy and to other people who are deeply concerned about continuing to make absolute privation, let's say, a thing of the past, and to many people as well who are hoping to ameliorate relative privation, which is more the concern of the left, as you already pointed out. And all of these people are also aware, and Stephen Fry, for that matter, Stephen has allied himself